Over the past year, it seemed like no matter who I talked to that played Signalis, I kept getting the same response back. Signalis is a glorious return to form for the genre, a masterpiece harkening back to the days of PS1 era Resident Evil and Silent Hill. So, when my first playthrough got pretty turbulent on me, I wondered what I was missing. Perhaps the easiest way to illustrate my struggle was a puzzle I found late game involving a safe with a 4-letter code required to open it. I looked to the right of the safe and noticed a display case full of butterflies with the word pareidolia written next to it. I had to look up the definition of pareidolia, naturally, and discovered that it meant seeing a specific or meaningful image in an otherwise ambiguous visual pattern. Using my 2020 hindsight, it seems clear that I was supposed to look into the butterfly's wings to see the hidden letters I needed for the safe code, but ironically, I couldn't perceive these letters, or even quite imagine how this visual even had anything to do with what I needed to find. So while this vignette encapsulates my early impressions of Signalis, the game's rabid fan base of theory crafters, fan artists, and shit posters alike did not share my discombobulation. They turned this little indie gem into a word-of-mouth smash hit, vindicating the 8-year-long development cycle by creators Rose Engine, a 2-person team of Yuri Stern and Barbara Wittmann, or Barbara Wittmann, if you're being cool in German.
Oh, you know it.
So when I bounced off the game, I wondered if I was just missing something right in front of me yet again, just like I had with the pareidolia puzzle. In my defense, though, there's quite a lot to take in. As the game's first trailer notes, Signalis is a dream about dreaming, so as you might expect, things get pretty weird. The narrative is non-linear and fragmented, and we follow the android Elster as she searches for a missing woman through several facilities, her journey plagued by monsters and her surroundings threatening to warp around her at any moment. Cutscenes are cryptic, with brief flashes of images and text in 3 different languages, gone almost as fast as they appeared. And if this sensory overload wasn't already enough, your intellect and your powers of recall are tested by copious references to Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Blade Runner, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Ghost in the Shell, Blame, Lovecraftian horror, mathematical concepts, classical music, paintings, philosophy, psychology, religion, and more. I showed this list of influences to my dad, and he said, matter-of-factly, "That's pretty geeky, huh?" And this coming from the guy who reads theology and history books like they're going out of style. And yet, somehow all these allusions and homages aren't just name drops or DiCaprio memes, but a curated network of complementary symbols that, once comprehended, greatly redefine what the game means and why it matters. This is especially true of the various endings. In fact, the reading of these endings is what compelled me to make this video in the first place. So many Signalis fans, well-meaning or otherwise, shrug off thinking too hard about nailing down the game's interpretation, saying that it's almost entirely up to personal preference anyway, so we should just content ourselves with what the game makes us feel in the end and move on. Yuri Stern did after all say in an interview that the heart of any work is, how will this make me feel? And to be fair, Signalis is constructed in such a way that it validates several overlapping but ultimately competing readings of itself, like an abstract painting waiting to be contemplated over and again versus a mathematical equation to be solved once for all. That said, though, developer Yuri Stern also curiously implied that Signalis' world building needed to live up to the high standards expected from Stern's favorite fiction, and that Signalis would adhere to the principles of a good mystery, which is, quote, able to give every detail meaning the audience can deduct, but never simply explaining the meaning. So is it possible, then, to figure out Signalis, or is it intentionally incomprehensible? Now, I don't profess to have the answer, as there are quite a few loose ends in all theories I'm finding, but I think I have a pretty defensible and at least useful interpretation that plays along with the spirit of the game's themes. I think there's a lot more of this game that can be figured out than most fans want to admit. Perhaps I'm just falling under the spell of pareidolia or apophenia as I pored over Signalis' lore for months. But I truly think that Signalis players are missing out if they don't go down these rabbit holes, because once I did, I found a veritable wonderland of thematic harmony that you just don't get experiencing the game merely sensorially or just for fun and then moving on. But this is a really big can of brainworms to open. Let's just go ahead and get stuck in. First things first, before we get into this chunky story analysis, I'm going to take a couple minutes to critique the presentation, inventory management, controls, combat, level and puzzle design, and give a basic story hook to get started. Then we'll build on that story hook by going into a full-on spoiler section with my interpretation. So why is this any different than the million other Signalis videos on YouTube? Well, for one, I'm going to avoid the pitfalls of mispronouncing almost every name and place like so many others do, and we're going to do more than just synopsize the story. We're going to really try and make some conclusions that help us make sense of what we should feel from Signalis and what its message seems to be. I'm going to be tough, but also fair, because Signalis' rich blend of ideas deserves to be taken that seriously. So let's take a crack at interpreting Restless Dreams and see if we can truly figure out what or who the signal is. Let's begin our Signalis with a simple question. What the fudge popsicle is a Signalis? Well, if you ask the web, it's the Esperanto word meaning signal. Okay, not very exciting, is it? A much more useful etymology is the word signalis, that is Latin for signal, but in the genitive case, which indicates that it's a possessive noun, meaning it's a signal that belongs to someone. Belonging is of central importance to Signalis, or more specifically, the search for someone that you belong to is. Not only is the game interested in how deep interpersonal relationships survive inside a tyrannical collectivist society, but it's also interested in how individuals express and maintain their individual identity to themselves in relation to the perception of others. When Yuri Stern was asked in a Vice interview how successful Rose Engine had been at forging a separate identity from its influences, we got this answer. A central question of Signalis is, what is the worth of a replica, a copy of a copy? What does it mean to exist primarily in reference to something else? I think that's up to each player to decide for themselves. Does the strength of art lie in how well it pretends to exist in a vacuum? Stern's co-dev, Barbara Whitman, continued this thought, adding that the game exists in a conversation with the works it's inspired by. Signalis is so intentionally indebted to many seminal works, a replica of sorts in and of itself. It owes many story beats to Silent Hills 1 and 2 and the rhythm and gameplay considerations of early Resident Evils. From RE, we also get the Moonlight Sonata and butterfly imagery, a limited inventory, and water tank and fuse puzzles. From Silent Hill, we get a radio, a red save screen, insistence on dropping down ominous holes, and an entire level's name and concept in nowhere. Our very first major area even starts with our heroine Elster looking soulfully into a mirror, holding a photo of the woman she's searching for, mirroring James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2's opening. No pun intended. Elster certainly lives out many Silent Hill 2 shticks, but she also exemplifies Signalis' fixation on identity. Elster, or LSTR-512, is a replica of the combat engineer variety. Much like the replicants in Blade Runner, replicas have been created to serve specific purposes in society, like domestic duties, engineers, or security detail in labor camps. Replicas are created using the brain patterns of existing humans called gestalts, whose skill set and personality match the intended function of the replica they're intending to create. But in order to maintain their focus and sanity, replicas must have these base memories from their Gestalt forebearer repressed and must be kept from certain stimuli that would trigger these memories. Notably, the German word Gestalt means something that is more than the sum of its parts, a sort of backhanded delineation against the replicas, who were very much seen as nothing more than the addition and subtraction of useful details. This fantastical process of creating replicas isn't very well understood either, as it's a product of bioresonance, which is, for lack of a better term, space magic. Space magic in Signalis is called, or at least tied to, the Song of the Gods, which is described like a universal music that can be heard by few and conducted by fewer still. Certain gifted gestalts and even replicas can tap into it to do crazy things like terraform planets, create artificial gravity, and influence people's minds and reality itself, or so the legends say. And these legends are plausible based on how much bioresonance plays into the central conflict of Signalis' world, the war between the Empire of Yusan and the rebel splinter faction known as the Nation of Yusan. The Empire first rose to power under the Grand Empress, a powerful bioresonant who created the replicas and whose, quote, immense will bent humanity into the Empire and lifted it to the stars. Sounds like a nice lady. But hey, at least she did cool stuff like making the Imperial Palace levitate above the poisonous gas clouds of the capital planet Buyan. Although this and other feats like it meant that the technology needed to pull off these feats never got made naturally, and so the Empire's tech prowess languished, leaving them in a state of alien-style cassette futurism. Things continued to stagnate as the Empress went quite a while without doing anything else in her reign, until she mysteriously committed suicide. It's likely that her influence was no longer able to hold the people under the sway of the Empire, and so the nation of Yusan was either born or came into its own under the leadership of the Great Revolutionary. The schism between the Empire and the nation resembles East and West Germany back before the Berlin Wall fell, two pretty terrible options clawing for dominance. On the planet Veneta, the two factions fought, and bombs were dropped on the planet, causing it to flood. According to a nation newspaper, the Empire destroyed supply lines to Veneta so that the stranded people starved to death. Not much else is known of the Empire except that it's recognizably more Germanic or Western in its culture, maintained its influence through mind control, and seems to almost religiously reference bioresonance. The nation of Yusan appears more Asiatic and is possibly even worse than Big Brother. Like the USSR or East Germany, they spread propaganda, restrict personal effects, police language and thought by banning books like the aforementioned Song of the Gods, arrest and torture dissidents and those suspected of bioresonance, and make military service or other war effort furthering endeavors compulsory. No matter where you turn, life isn't great for anyone but company men in the world of Signalis. Totalitarianism as we've seen it in Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, Hitler's Germany, and modern-day North Korea are here in full force, stamping out the individual's desires and dreams in service of the big machine. We get a front-row seat to the way the nation operates, visiting various of the 3 planets they still control, Rotfront, Ling, and Heimat, and the Empire still holding on to Kitej, Veneta, and their aforementioned capital beyond. Now, because we're always playing on nation soil, it means we're getting secondhand knowledge of the Empire from the nation's POV, all the while getting an eyeful of all the horrendous shit that the nation is definitely doing. Case in point, the first section we play through occurs inside the S-23 Sierpinski, a mining labor camp for those either unfit for military duty or who couldn't crack it anywhere else. And when you get to Sierpinski, you find something much worse than just a missing woman. The facility's been overrun by bloodthirsty replicas driven mad by some infection boiling up from a fleshy overgrowth that was discovered down in the mines. Looks like your journey is going to be much harder than you first thought. Well, that's our creepy hook, and man, does Signalis' presentation do work on selling this atmosphere. As you cautiously make your way through Sierpinski, you can't help but notice Yuri Stern's excellent eye for suspenseful composition. The pixelated graphics provoke even more terror because of the detail they withhold, and I've never seen an isometric camera angle so effectively approximate the fixed camera angles of Alone in the Dark or Resident Evil. While you're essentially side-scrolling through a 3D plane and hallways, once you enter the various side rooms, you'll be treated to a wide variety of layouts with bespoke assets and options for cover. Some big rooms are often a tense game of chicken as you walk to the edge of the frame and the camera moves with you to reveal the rest of the space, possibly running you into a nasty surprise of an enemy hiding in the corner. I also really like that everything in Signalis is in full 3D, as evidenced by the first and over-the-shoulder third-person viewpoints you can hack into the game. It really makes the game have a spatial depth and tactility most non-FPS indie games lack. And what's probably the most unique about Signalis' visual style is its varieties of classic anime art a la Blame or Evangelion. Cutscenes alternate between moody anime stills and in-engine sequences with faceless, almost doll-like animations. At seemingly random times, English, German, and kanji text will take up the whole screen, teasing you with cryptic info too specific to ignore, but often too fleeting or vague to comprehend. All these elements swimming together comports to an incredibly disorienting but intoxicating feeling that doesn't appeal much to the head, but to the senses. The real cherry on top of the sensory experience is the game's sound design. Much like Signalis proper was created by one duo, so too is Signalis' score, being composed by 1,000 Eyes and Cicada Sirens. I find it deliciously spine-chilling that a game with a Twin Peaksian obsession with doppelgangers and mirror cells would be created by 2 teams of 2.
I'm freaking out, man.
Akira Yamaoka's Silent Hill work is a clear inspiration here, which, if you're not familiar with him, you can hear many examples of his work in my horror soundtracks video, plug, 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 plug. The only problem with the soundtrack? If you're not wearing headphones, it's almost impossible to hear because it's mixed so low, which is a crying shame. Now, not only is its score stellar, but Signalis' sound design is punching way above its weight. The haunting 3-note oddity sounds every time you're on the main menu, a sequence that used to play on old radio stations like Jeopardy music in between broadcasts or as hold music in German phone lines. Now, as for your weapons, they all sound great. The shotgun sounds like you're kicking a door down, and the pistol pops like it's gonna drop whatever it connects with, and has the crunkest reload ka-ching! And don't get me started on how cool the creatures sound, screeching like alien xenomorphs when alerted. And since we're talking about reload animations and enemies already, it's as good a time as any to examine Signalis' gameplay loop. For Resident Evil fans, Signalis is going to feel pretty darn great most of the time. Signalis' gameplay runs through the classic tropes of inventory management, combat, puzzle solving, and backtracking to retrieve items your inventory couldn't hold the first go-around. You'll frequently consult your map, planning routes and intuiting where puzzle items might be based on the function of areas. I also love the fact that the game required me to take pictures or write notes about clues I found so that I could use them for later. Elster's movement is silky, and a lot of praise should be given to how she moves just fast enough to feel like you're making good time, but just slow enough where you're pushing that stick or holding that key like a madman in hopes you can just slink by that enemy in a crowded hallway without getting smacked. When Signalis feels good, it's akin to the engrossing Metroidvania rhythms of the Resident Evil 2 remake, which I regard as one of the best games I've ever played. There's a wonderful sense of suspense and escalation in the first Sierpinski level especially, different enemies being introduced one by one, then with carefully tuned configurations of mobs in areas that allow just enough room to skillfully dodge past them. Puzzles are always diverse and often quite creative, if a little confusing, but at least their pieces are spread out just enough to make them feel spontaneous without feeling too random. The most innovative puzzle mechanic is the radio, likely inspired by Silent Hill 2's radio that crackled when enemies were near. Signalis' radio is a far more interesting and proactive tool though. Using the radio to broadcast at certain frequencies to obtain safe codes was a particular highlight. A radar tower puzzle broadcasts music on a certain frequency that you can then tune your radio to and play when you're next to a sound-activated lock. It's such a clever mechanic, I have no doubt people will try to rip off or improve upon it for years to come. It's that good. Unfortunately, for all these singular triumphs, Signalis has some trouble keeping up a pleasant rhythm due to some unforgiving design choices. The most pressing gripe I have is the amount of menu surfing you have to do. You will need to dive into your map frequently because so much backtracking is required, and quite a lot of the hallways and doors look similar. Much of the backtracking isn't bad early on, but the simple act of knowing which direction to go is made very tedious by the map being on the third and final menu screen, which you must click 3 times to get to, and once more if you needed to free look or zoom around the map further. The map desperately needed to have its own dedicated button to avoid this extremely unnecessary routine. But, if you grit your teeth, this pet peeve can be endured. What is really hard to stomach, though, is Signalis' 6-item inventory limit and how you're expected to mitigate this limitation. Stern defends this choice by saying that early playtesters abused bigger inventories by just picking everything up that they saw, even if they quote-unquote didn't need it, whatever that means. But levels are absolutely littered with health, ammo, and debuff items, and since you want all the help you can get because, you're trying to actually survive the horror, you'll understandably pick up all this stuff in case you need it later, but also so you don't have to come all the way back out here for it. But you frequently have a full inventory by the time you find keys and other items essential for progression that you have to pick up, prompting you to have to go all the way back to the save room to dump your inventory and come all the way back to where you were to pick up that said key. No items but your precious ammo can be destroyed to make space, which is rarely desirable, and nothing can be dropped in place and returned to like in the original Alone in the Dark. Early Resident Evil games let you travel light, as you would naturally expend resources soon after picking them up. But Signalis' combat is often too easy to avoid, and you end up not being able to naturally expend enough stuff to create space, which wouldn't be a real problem if you could just destroy or drop things at will. This problem becomes doubly irritating when you must carry around the flashlight for large portions of the game. Despite this thing being shoulder-mounted, it takes up an inventory slot, and so do keys and even tarot cards, which is ridiculous. To avoid boring backtracking so you don't miss out on any valuables lying around, Rose Engine just needed a better inventory system. Add at least 1 or 2 more slots, or maybe even use Resident Evil's traditional grid-based style that rewards clever positioning, or perhaps divide items up by type and allow up to a certain amount of each type to offset all the backtracking annoyance of an agnostic inventory where everything carries a value of 1. But no matter which way you slice it, Signalis incentivizes a gotta collect them all mentality, but often punishes you for lacking the clairvoyance to know that you'd want to leave a space or 2 open for quest items soon.
Wait! There's more!
So, an update just went live around Thanksgiving 2023 that made it possible to play the game with up to 8 inventory slots, or you can simply opt to make the flashlight not take up a slot. Not only that, but you can use health items even while at full health now to clear an inventory slot. These are all really good solutions to the problems I just mentioned, and I'm glad that Rose Engine finally took it upon themselves to respond to the feedback they'd been getting, though it taking them a year to do so that it just left Game Pass before I could test this out is pretty lame. But cheers, I may just get it on sale one day and try it out for myself. But that's not the only design choice that has unreasonable expectations of the player. as at least one puzzle and 2 boss fights essentially auto-fail you out of nowhere unless you Goldilocks your way through on sheer luck alone. The vending machine puzzle is one such offender. It's essentially a maze, but the problem is that you can go too far in the wrong direction and get stuck because of the restriction on the directions that you can move, hard locking you out of completing the puzzle so you have to reload a save, which is just obnoxious. Now, as for the boss fights that don't quite play fair, let's start with the Chimera. The Chimera boss takes a ton of damage before going down, and the 10-minute stretch of wandering hallways and even a cutscene you'll have to sit through will give you no indication that a resource-taxing fight is upcoming. And even worse, the boss arena itself provides you with 0 ammo to offset this lack of warning. So you'll likely do what I did unless you happen to have a flare gun or tons of pistol ammo. Die miserably and have to reload your save and go through this whole 10-minute trip all over again. Appreciate it. This frustrating kind of trial and error design crops up again in the last boss fight too, so brief spoilers. I'll blur out the boss here to make this point, but fair warning if you're sensitive to this type of thing, skip to here to jump past this short diatribe before we get back into non-spoilers. I always either ran out of ammo or simply could never miss, having to line up precise shots over and over while fighting the finicky aiming system, which is not built for speed or panic at all. The flare gun mysteriously stopped doing anything to her despite whooping every other enemy's ass. In a twist that would give Monty Xander psychic damage, the machine gun was the only way it could kill her, its high DPS taking advantage of the small windows in which she was vulnerable. I was also put off by the constant visual distortion and enemy overload in a small arena compounded with completely random ammo drops that appeal to no loadout anyone should bring. And those ammo drops and health items lying around, they're stupid hard to pick up in the heat of battle because the activate prompt requires perfect alignment of Elster's model with an item, and even then you have to click through an item pop-up screen, which doesn't stop the actions, so you could be taking cheap damage just by doing basic actions. This same problem happens frequently in-game in regards to doors and ladders too. So while much of the game is pretty awesome, there are long stretches where I truly despise Signalis. The arbitrariness of some puzzles and boss fights, and the inability to balance item pickups with inventory size was super frustrating. The middle section of the game also takes away your map. It's very large and full of locked doors that all look the same, but require different codes to unlock, so it's a nightmare to remember where you've been already and where to apply door codes once you've found them. The final area is better designed with less punishing enemy variety and a satisfying layout to memorize, but even it starts to edge the needle towards cruel once you start finding 6 tarot cards for a puzzle. You pick these up one after the other after a long stretch of level, but due to the fact that you've only got 6 inventory slots and have needed to carry ammo and health to get here in the first place, you'll have to ferry what you can hold back to your save room in at least 2 trips, and then ferry them to the puzzle room to apply them. This last section also gets you familiar with the layout of the level, but then starts blocking off the direct route you just memorized and making you travel almost a half level longer to get to your destination. It's honestly just kind of indulgent, as if trying to adhere to some survival horror games were hardcore back in my day mantra yet again. Although I'm sure Under the Mayo just mayoed in his pants listening to that complaint.
I want a challenge.
The most unfortunate critique I can level Signalis' way is how removed I felt from its story the first go-around. The game spreads out your attention so thin over map management, backtracking, tense combat, and weird puzzles, playing the game, that it's really hard to care about what tidbits of narrative exist in the first half of the game especially, as they seem so uninterested in being comprehended anyway. Now, I go into such negative detail up front because I don't think anyone's really held Signalis to the fire for almost anything that it sucks at, which is just weirdly sycophantic to me. I also want to indicate my respect for this honestly impressive project, no matter how many things I don't like about it, because let's be honest, there's a lot to love, and that's going to be no more apparent than when we go crazy on the story, tits to toes, starting right about now. So let's make like Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and become an interpreter of restless dreams. Funnily enough, a theory crafting deep dive like this being necessary at all seems antithetical to Yuri Stern's own authorial goals. Stern claimed that every good mystery can be solved by the audience without being handed the answers because each detail carries useful clues. Stern also admits to being, quote, one of those annoying people who loves poking at the holes in the world building of the books and movies that I consume. So a lot of the world building for Signalis is a result of my own questioning of the logic of the world we are creating for the game. So you'd think that Signalis would be ironclad in its construction, even if maybe a little fragmented and nonlinear. but I'm dubious if the storytelling lives up to this standard or is even truly concerned with it. In fact, I'd say that Signalis' goals are much more similar to those expressed in the opening lines of Alan Wake.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end.
Hideaki Anno once said this about Evangelion, but it works so well for Signalis too, likely because of Evangelion's pervading influence on it. So if we replace the word Evangelion with Signalis, then we get Signalis is, quote, like a puzzle. Any person can see it and give their own answer. In other words, we're offering viewers to think by themselves so that each person can imagine their own world. Don't expect to get answers. Don't expect to get catered to all the time. We all have to find our own answers. Alan Wake, Evangelion, and Lynchian stuff like Twin Peaks all traffic in this intentionally subjectivist realm, and Signalis follows suit, arranging a complex Venn diagram of overlapping, equally plausible but ultimately competing interpretations within itself. It's masterful, but it's also maddening to get anything more than a sort of surface-level reaction to the mood of the ending sequences, with their stirring score and powerful juxtaposition of images. So to make our interpretation much less painful, we need to start out with the information that we are pretty sure as a community is to be trusted, and that is the backstory of Elster and Ariane Young's journey aboard the Penrose 512 ship, a sequence which I think most fans will reasonably call the emotional core of the story. Ariane Young is undoubtedly the most important character in Signalis, no matter what interpretation you subscribe to. Ariane was born to Irish Young on the planet Lang. Early in her youth, Ariane and her mother Iris moved to the icy waste of Rotfront, where Iris worked at Number Station 6. Ariane even recalls a weird detail where her mother one day sat next to the radio taking notes while the real-life book called The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers sat on her lap, a book which notably inspired much of H.P. Lovecraft's work. But without any friends or schooling, Ariane was a shy, introverted child who took to painting and was often attracted to fiction and books about the Empress, which were either discouraged or outright banned inside the nation of Yusan. Her aunt Camilla doesn't think this isolated existence is fitting for a member of the nation, and so she recommends to some officials that Ariane be relocated to Mandelbrot Polytechnische Oberschule. Unfortunately, due to her reserved nature, prematurely white hair, and the nation's disdain for art, Ariane was violently bullied. An onlooking fellow student named Itou froze up in fear, but her twin sister Erica intervened, and the three became acquaintances thereafter. Ariane even visited their family bookstore when not working for her aunt's Photoshop, and she saw a copy of The King in Yellow like her mother had, but was unable to read it before the nation law enforcement confiscated it. Notably, we see Ariane in a train at one point, likely going to or from school, and a Penrose program poster is on the wall of this train, which will come into the picture soon. Apparently, during her school years, Ariane was found out somehow by an Imperial spy to have bioresonant abilities, and eventually Aeon, the organization that puts on the Penrose program, was alerted to this during a checkup for her residual maladies from bullying. Aeon tested her bioresonance with a planetary tarot card exercise where she guessed what was on the other side of the card without physically being able to see it, and the nation withheld their findings from her that she was indeed bioresonant. The nation seems deeply suspicious of bioresonance and seeks to either weaponize it or control it, possibly even get rid of it. The S-23 Sierpinski is run entirely by replicas and commanded by a powerful bioresonant Falke unit. Furthermore, Julia Huang is arrested in the note's search protocol for suspected bioresonance, so clearly the nation of Yusan is very particular about anyone rising out without their control and using their bioresonant powers. Now, after a teacher recommended her, Ariane became a radio officer for the military on Rotfront, just like her mother. But she was all alone here, the Itou twins being sent to the battlefront and likely dying, if the black ribbons on their portraits in-game are any indication. And after 2 years of this job, Ariane wanted out, and she applied to the Penrose program she'd seen back in school. It was either this, or be reassigned to the S-23 Sierpinski mining facility back on Ling, her birth world. So she took to the solitude of the stars. The Penrose program was an initiative by Aeon to send out scout vessels to search for new planets and resources and possibly even alien life. The exact reason for this mission isn't entirely clear, and the highly propagandized pie-in-the-sky nature of its marketing materials indicate it was something of a show of strength for the nation, but possibly also an attempt to open up trade routes or bone up on resources as they continued with the Empire. Ariane barely cared, though, either way, because this finally meant that she could be free, away from the prying eyes of the nation, to do what she wanted, which was paint, listen to music, read fiction, and whatever else she wanted to do. Accompanying her on this journey was an LSTR-512 combat engineer unit, which is an idea that Ariane is not excited about at first, but soon warms up to, finding the Venetan accent that Elster shares with the Itous back home to be endearing. In her carefree haste, Ariane neglects to even open the instructional packet that Eon left her for the Elster unit, warning her against exposing Elster to any music or movies, especially those regarding the war, and to not fraternize with her. In fact, Ariane and Elster soon fall for each other, watching old war movies and propaganda, poring over old photographs, watching Ariane paint various seaside vistas, and dancing the endless nights away to music like the Swan theme from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. They continue in this way for many cycles until they receive a transmission from the Penrose program officials. In it, Ariane is informed that if they have not found any habitable worlds, resources, or alien life by now, they are unlikely to, and should prepare for a system's failure. As it turns out, the nation was perfectly okay with sending out fodder ships to hope to score new resources, but hadn't equipped the ships to survive the journey back home. The transmission indicates that Ariane is unlikely to withstand the radiation seeping from the eroding reactor for long, and to have her Elster unit kill her to avoid suffering, taking comfort in the fact that she served the nation well. But Ariane keeps this information to herself and carries on living as she had with Elster, none the wiser. But soon she grows sicker and sicker, her hair and teeth falling out, her body racked with pain, unable to sleep. Sensing something is wrong, Elster puts Ariane in a cryopod before succumbing to her own maladies, leaving Ariane to suffer alone. Pretty heavy stuff, huh? Well, we are only just getting started. Now, let me summarize the rest of the game really quickly so we have a good baseline for analysis later. Now, in the intro of the game, Elster wakes up from cryo in a crashed pod on an unknown planet, and Ariane's missing, so she goes out into the waste in an orange spacesuit to look for her, passing through a gate and down into two holes that inexplicably lead her to a radio control room with a chain safe and a copy of The King in Yellow inside. Clearly, this is Ariane's room, probably back at school, and the game proper begins once we click on the King in Yellow. This brings us to Chapter 1, Synchronicitat, or Synchronization. Okay, Yuri, did I get you? I know how much you hate it when people just YOLO the translation of this word as synchronization, so I figured I'd tease you for just a second. Synchronicitat, or tet, actually means synchronicity, a Jungian concept used to describe circumstances that appear meaningfully related yet lack a causal connection. So, kind of like everything in this game, hence why it's so hard to come by any meaningful conclusions or make good analysis videos about it, which is not something you want to write when you're up to 56 pages of this script and feeling very delicate about how good this is going to be already. Perhaps this is hell. So then we play through the Sierpinski level, which is not doing well for itself. The facility's commander, Falke, went through a gate like the one Elster did and came back insane, and her bad vibes seem to be rebroadcast by the psychic Calibri units, who are especially susceptible to strong emotional signals. This in turn started spreading Falke's madness into the other replicas and gestalts, causing the replicas to start degrading into fleshy monsters somehow. Elster makes her way through this facility towards the mines, meeting Itou in the process, and also the vicious replica Adler, who's Commander Falke's right-hand man, and who's trying to protect her through lethal force. Eventually, Elster jumps down another dark hole and is transported to a dark beach before a countdown timer expires and we are whisked away yet again, this time to an infected mirror world of the Sierpinski called Nowhere, which is totally overrun by the flesh. Here, we collect 6 seals which look just like the ones on the spine of the King in Yellow book that we've seen so far, and once the way forward is open, we are suddenly in a red emptiness where Adler awaits at a gate like the one from the intro. We walk through the gate and onto the Penrose, where we fail to open the hatch, tearing our arm off and falling to the ground to die. Ariane visits us and compels us to remember our promise and wake up. And so we do, the cycle beginning again, and we are warped to Rotfront to solve a tarot card puzzle as this facility on the other side of the galaxy gets overrun by the flesh too. Once we open the way forward, we find ourselves again inexplicably traveling through a small hole to Ariane's old dorm room. We pick up the King in Yellow again and find ourselves in the midst of the Commander Falke, who has risen from troubled, sickened sleep in a rage as she's been driven mad by her personality being overwritten by Ariane and Elster's encroaching memories. We kill her in all but one of the endings, but we'll get to all the repercussions of your actions at the very end of the video. For now though, let's try and make some sense of what the hell led up to these endings, and then we'll tackle those endings separately. Now, I tried all manner of metaphysical juggling to make other theories work, but the Occam's razor principle of prioritizing the lowest maintenance explanation with the fewest assumptions made seemed the best course. So I went straight to the most obvious influences in Silent Hill and The King in Yellow. This led me to the conclusion that everything in Signalis is likely generated by Ariane's subconscious, likely a bioresonant fever dream where her fears and desires manifest themselves in forms both heroic and horrible and illustrate the struggle between vengeance and love inside of Ariane's heart. Now, some may try and counter with the argument that it's a blend of reality and dream, but a dream about dreaming seems pretty fucking clear for one, and for another, if the reality is the dream, or the dream is the reality, then I think we wind up at the same place regardless. Now, I know a lot of people hate this dream theory stuff, and I get it. The "it's all a dream" trope usually sucks. But here, the flexibility of a dreamscape is used deftly, showing fantastic sights and vivid emotional states that linear and literal storytelling methods probably couldn't deliver nearly as well. Now, of course, this is a big claim to make, so let's just get into proving it. We'll branch out into how the game proves this thesis through convenient dream logic, recurring motifs, the way the characters are self-aware of their unreality, and then we'll analyze the endings and see what conclusions we draw about what Ariane has become and whether there be monsters here like the King in Yellow actually influencing things behind the scenes. Signalis gives us key clues as to what mode to interpret it by, and that's by directly referencing and mimicking many parts of the King in Yellow, the Silent Hill games, and what I'm pretty sure is inspired by the Alan Wake series. For instance, Alan Wake has shared dreams with recurring motifs and archetypes from Jung's collective unconscious, and in Signalis we see common legends and folklore like the Red Eye of Rotfront skewing public perception, and we also see Jungian concepts like synchronicity mentioned. Both games' enemies are essentially possessed. Both feature characters who are aware that they're part of someone else's story. The shadow selves like Falke are similar to Barbara Jagger and Mr. Scratch. Both games have time loops, and the way the Dark Place lets people bring their creations to life is really similar to how Ariane seems to be dreaming up what we play through in Signalis. Let's also not forget how Ariane reminds Elster to wake up, which sounds an awful lot like Alan, wake up. Or how Alan Wake's DLC, The Signal, all the way through to American Nightmare has him hunting down a transmission, or a signal. I mean, at first I just thought I had Alan Wake on the brain because that's what I've been playing recently, but the evidence just really started piling up. I figured I'd point this out as I'm seeing next to no buzz online about these similarities, so there you go. Anyway, as for other defining influences, we've got Silent Hill and The King in Yellow. The King in Yellow book shares its name with the play within it that drives the characters mad the more they read, even inciting a madness epidemic across the world at one point. The contents of the play are kept intentionally vague, only being revealed in excerpts, but the gist is that the King in Yellow surreptitiously manipulates cultures that are already in moral peril, often spiriting away people and places to his realm of Carcosa. The flesh that permeates Sierpinski feels a lot like the maddening influence in the King in Yellow, and the king having no presence outside of the book and showing up in weird places is a cool homage to the clandestine, almost totally unseen menace of the king in Chambers' book. People and locations being warped through time and space in Signalis definitely mimics the king's MO in the book, as does the similarity between how the king takes hold of corrupted cultures, much like he might be doing to the fatally divided galaxy between empire and nation. Now, as for Silent Hill's influence on Signalis, as you may know, its whole shtick is that troubled souls venture into the mystical town of Silent Hill and are confronted by and asked to find closure with the manifestations of their guilt and trauma, from thematically relevant monsters to mirror versions of people they knew from the outside world. Now, few would argue that the Silent Hill games are meant to be taken hyper-literally, as the whole conceit and part of the fun is piecing together what these things represent so you can eventually empathize with and understand the main character's psyche. I think Signalis is the best Silent Hill clone you could ask for because it masterfully recaptures this exact format and goal without just being a copy of a copy. In fact, I think it's even more strict in its construction than any of the Silent Hills, in that while it's billed as a dream about dreaming, it's also more specifically a surrealist stage play like the one mentioned in The King in Yellow, a play that's being directed by Ariane's subconscious memory. The characters play their roles as they would have in base reality, but are becoming more aware that there is someone out there Kubricking, or directing with too heavy a hand. The analytical replica Adler describes this disconnect perfectly. It's like everything was taken apart and put back together by someone who didn't know how it worked. For instance, Ariane never went to the S-23 Sierpinski facility on Lang because she joined the Penrose program, so we get to travel through her best approximation of it. The world is rife with reference to her life and things that are too congruent not to be constructed subconsciously from one specific person's mind and viewpoint. Ariane hangs over Signalis like an Oort cloud, and no part of it seems untouched by her influence or outside of her gaze, as the world curiously reflects parts of her life that don't make any sense being in the part of the facilities that you're in. We see the Itou's photo shop that Ariane visited, and also noticed how similar the gas masks of the infected Sierpinski replicas are to the inexplicably masked bullies at Mandelbrot. I see no reason why students would need to wear this unless they're trying to conceal their identity like Antifa does, but regardless, it's too likely that Ariane's resentment is boiling over and infecting these replicas so that they act like and resemble the bullies that traumatized her. Sounding more and more like Silent Hill, isn't it? I gotta say, it's hard to ignore the similarities between Ariane and Alessa Gillespie from the first Silent Hill. Alessa is the only daughter of a medium who's part of the cult called the Order. Silent Hill 3's strategy guide even claims that the Order magically conjured her up to house the embryo of their god within her. As such, Alessa exhibited many supernatural abilities at a young age, was called a witch, and bullied just like Ariane. Alessa's mother physically abuses her for her lack of belief in their cause, and Alessa, like Ariane, retreats into works of fiction to escape her reality. Eventually, Alessa's mother burns her alive in an attempt to awaken the god within her, but Alessa splits her soul by astral projection, leaving the god within her dormant, but inadvertently setting the dark side of her tortured soul to plague Silent Hill sometime thereafter. The real bow on all of this for Signalis theory crafters is the Book of Lost Memories, one of the 4 items needed to complete Silent Hill 2's occult ritual Rebirth Ending, which mentions calling on the old gods to resurrect Laura. In the book, Alessa is referred to as the Empress for her overwhelming presence in Silent Hill, a tarot card motif that often connotates motherhood, creatorship, and nurturing. Signalis' Grand Empress was a powerful psychic herself, was the head of the Empire, and the mother and creator of replicas. These tarot cards clearly inspired the puzzle in Rotfront, and Ariane is said to greatly resemble the Empress with her white hair, and now even more so with her bioresonance, so the similarities kind of pile up. All that to say, Ariane and Alessa share a childhood of ostracization, bullying, retreat into fiction, and oppression from the power structures around them, and I think these through lines inform a lot of what we're supposed to get out of Ariane's story. Like Alessa in Silent Hill, it's likely that the fleshy infection in Signalis is an illustration of Ariane suffering from radiation poisoning as she lies sleeping in cryo. Signalis then becomes a wish fulfillment dream of her assuming a role of power and ownership of her life through the power of memory. The most obvious instances of dream logic and how this world is being constructed from memory in kind of a pieced together subconscious way is how you can acquire items from within flashbacks and take them back to the game world. The Sierpinski presents itself as a regular, pragmatically designed place where machines do the heavy lifting and everything works as intended. We solve a door puzzle by lining up the pins in the lock, open doors with key cards, and unlock the butterfly box with a key. Inside that box, though, is where things get weird. Upon touching the 6-sided plate of eternity inside, we see a vision of red, pulsing flesh, a door with 6 symbols on it, and then we're transported to the snowy outpost of Rotfront Sector C. We see a lily like the one we later see in Elster and Ariane's Penrose 512 Journey flashback, and we see those Imperial serial novels from earlier that have a heroically cast Empress on the cover. And when we pick up the radio module off the desk, we're teleported right in front of the butterfly box inside the Sierpinski base on Lang, a totally different time and place than Rotfront years ago in Ariane's childhood. Similarly, when you insert the video cassette into the video player, you're transported to a train where Ariane is sitting, and you retrieve a golden key from where she was sitting once she disappears, and you bring it back with you to the game world. Even bioresonance's handy-dandy reshaping reality doesn't seem to account for reaching back through time into another individual's life and retrieving a piece of matter to bring back into your current one. The metaphysics here are so impossible to define. I think it's safe to surmise that this is a dream with carefully curated information so that it educates the player on lore and character motivation, but is functionally sort of an open book on what comes and goes as Ariane's subconscious and Rose Engine's preferences dictate. Further evidence of the world operating on dream logic or feeling a little contrived intentionally is the entirety of Nowhere, which feels like an incredibly stylish area created to house puzzles that explain backstory like the Grand Empress Ring puzzle, or the weird mazes blocked off by razor-sharp wire and which house hexagonal artifacts. Definitely contrived more for gameplay purposes primarily, not to mention the fact that Nowhere is clearly a dark mirror of the Sierpinski facility anyway, as several landmarks repeat. Now, not only is the level design emblematic of a place definitely not operating under consistent real-world rules, but there are several recurring motifs like numbers, shapes, concept, and images that infect nearly every frame and give us a surreal, altered state of reality or dreaming, which I think are mostly semantic in Signalis. Mathematical concepts and numbers show up all over the place and seem specifically chosen to elicit the spiraling, nonlinear nature of this place. The Sierpinski facility is named after the Sierpinski triangle, which is a fractal geometric shape, meaning that similar patterns recur at progressively smaller scales, so triangles within triangles within triangles. I see this as an illustration of the copy of a copy concept used to describe Signalis itself, but which also applies to the replica creation process, which is said to decrease in quality the more times they copy a Gestalt's neural pattern. Arion's school in Rotfront was called the Mandelbrot Polytechnische Oberschule, and this references Benoit Mandelbrot's set concept that describes a shape whose parts begin self-similar, meaning the parts look identical to the whole at first, but then slowly diverge as they repeat, a likely metaphor for how Elster comes to discover herself apart from mirrored and programmed actions tugging at her like fate. Lastly, we see the Penrose Triangle, or the Impossible Triangle, created by Oscar Reuterswärd, Lionel and Roger Penrose, and used in M.C. Escher's work. This shape is impossible to render in 3D because it only looks like it connects at certain angles based on the viewer's perspective, but is also, of course, the name of the Penrose 512 ship itself, indicating that it's an impossible vessel, endlessly being returned to in the cycles of this dream that seem to be happening over and over, a concept which we'll get to shortly. As for individual numbers, 6 is prolific across Signalis' iconography. There are 6 habitable worlds in the solar system. You can only carry up to 6 items. The King in Yellow book has 6 seals on its spine. The seals you find in Nowhere are hexagonal or 6-sided, and so is Elster's status symbol in the menus and the oscillating fans in Sierpinski. That's not to mention how some cutscenes feature 6 different versions of Elster Ariane. The game's logo is a hexagon called the Artifact, and the 6 pillars and 6 Elsters in the Artifact ending. The hexagonal carpet from The Shining is also featured in many rooms. Now, why this number and shape crop up so much is purely speculation, but perhaps it's a reference to the 6th day of creation where God created humans. Perhaps a mirror of the Empress creating replicas dynamic, or maybe it's just a reference to hexagrams being used as talismans for conjuring spirits in occult rituals, as Itou is seen pulling off some weird blood ritual throughout the game, and the artifact ending seems to infer that Elster's doing something similar. Hexagons are even called the Seal of Solomon many times, which are there to bind demons. The 6 seals on the King in Yellow could certainly be said to be keeping a demon bound. Like bound, like how a book has a binding because the seals are on the binding. Seals are also likely some reference to the 6th seal being broken and unleashing the apocalypse like in the biblical book of Revelation. Another number that repeats is the number 512, which is part of Elster's model number, LSTR-512, the number of the Penrose ship, the number of the classroom that Issa wakes up in the Ariane bullying flashback, the number of a P.O. box you get a key out of, the number of the apartment in which Elster solves the tarot card puzzle in the Rotfront level, and, very interestingly, 512 also shows up on the broken wood palisades in the ditch where Elster's Gestalt was holed up at the Battle of Veneta, as we see in a flashback. The only interesting possible inspiration I found online for 512 as an important number was a Lamb of God song of the same name of all things. 512 was the jail cell number that the band's lead singer stayed in once for manslaughter. Now see if these lyrics don't remind you of Signalis. 6 bars laid across the sky, 4 empty walls to fill the time, 1 careless word, you lose your life, a grave new world awaits inside. My hands are painted red, my future's painted black. I can't recognize myself. I become someone else. Schizophrenic amnesia, bid goodbye to all you knew and loved. Forget the only life that you knew outside. The number 6, red and black, schizophrenia and amnesia. Amnesia? What? Schizophrenia and amnesia, the confused identity, and forget the only life that you knew outside. Again, this is all purely a speculative connection, but one that seems almost too conveniently similar, but, do with that what you will. Now, the point of pointing these out is that Signalis' repeating numbers seem almost intentionally arbitrary and without a frame of reference, as if it's just perpetuating itself across any place or thing that would bear a number, like a compulsory, unforgettable mantra, like what Ariane must have run through her mind 100,000 times while dying inside the cryopod. It's certainly plausible that the Penrose 512 is the traumatic center from which all other instances radiate. But 6 seems totally personal to the developers, and I think that's fine because it reveals it seems less intentional and more compulsory, instinctual, as dreams tend to be, led by untamed desires and thoughts. Now, I could probably go on longer about these weird ancillary details that imply Signalis is a dream, but getting to know the supporting cast will give us a lot more substantial perspective, so we can progress to the deeper symbols in the story like the time loop, the endings, and the question of who's actually in charge of this dream, Ariane or the King in Yellow. So, how stoked are the people of Ariane's dream to be here? Not very, to put it mildly. The Sierpinski facility and Rotfront are dark reflections of what they should be, and many of the replicas and gestalts within are starting to notice. None of us are here by choice, a flash screen reminds us. The replicas are here because they were brought into being without any say as to their function, and are largely under the sway of the nation, and the gestalt citizens are mostly here because they've outlived their usefulness elsewhere. But the most important dimension for our discussion right now is the idea that they've been plucked from reality into this parallel dimension of imagination and imperfect remembrance. The first character that's noticeably suffering from the dissociative effect of Ariane's dreaming is Alina Seo. Despite the game revealing later on that Ariane is the one whom Elster should be searching for due to their relationship on the Penrose 512, Elster opens the Sierpinski level with a picture of Alina Seo in her possession, albeit one that eventually morphs to show Ariane's face. Now, this is interesting because Alina was the inspiration for Ariane to join the military in the first place, imagining herself as Alina. Ariane's mother, Iris, even notes the two of them could be twins, they look so much alike. Early in Elster's journey, she finds a key to Sierpinski's West Wing with Alina's picture on it, her eyes red like Ariane's, and her face bandaged after a fall so that she looks like Ariane after her radiation poisoning. Alina's diary shows her fear of the replica infection at Sierpinski and her bewilderment at being unable to find Elster, whom she can't find any trace of. It's as if she'd never been here. Alina's also been losing track of time, her hair is turning white, and she seems to be remembering someone else's life. Ariane seems to be rewriting Alina into herself, symbolizing how she's taking her place as Elster's lover, inserting herself back into the narrative of this little pocket reality. Now, there are some clues as to who this gestalt lover of Alina actually was. In Alina's photo, or postcard, whatever you want to call it, there's a list of her military units' names. The prevailing theory is that Lilith Itou is the basis for Elster's neural pattern, is Alina's lover, and possibly somehow also the Itou twins' mother. Her surname is conspicuously the same as the twins, and she shares the first name with the powerful angel from Evangelion, who was the mother of all humanity, Evangelion being a huge influence on Signalis. But Rose Engine actually patched the game and updated the twins' medical files with a note from their actual mother whose name was Anja, or Anya. And Lilith's got no other evidence going for her other than these sort of circumstantial connections based on her seemingly meaningful names. But don't worry, despite a dedicated portion of Signalis' fanbase loving to shoot down anyone who's too attached to their own interpretation, a fair few Lilith bros still like to argue circularly that Lilith has to be the one in the photo because we see multiple flashbacks of Lilith's life, like her eye missing and her commemorating her fallen comrades and all that. But we've got something more to go on, fortunately. A much more plausible hypothesis, at least in terms of what's inside the game, is that Elster's gestalt basis was Anna Huang, as her name appears on that list on Alina's photo, and the last name Huang shows up again inside of the safe next to the pareidolia puzzle. Now, of course, the catch here is that there are two other Huangs in the game to consider, but neither of these Huangs were on the list on Alina's photo. So I can't imagine that this is meaning to reference anyone else but Anna, though the very term pareidolia being next to the safe with an uncertain clue might be a clever joke in and of itself. Perhaps we're meant to think it's her, and it's not. One really cool little detail that shows up elsewhere that perhaps contradicts this self-doubt is the butterflies next to her safe match the butterflies that flutter around Elster at the Sierpinski and Rotfront bathroom scenes, and they seem too congruent to be ignored. Butterflies being a symbol of rebirth as they burst from their cocoons and the butterflies showing up at the beginning of new cycles in Signalis seems pretty intentional and significant, perhaps indicating her inextricable link to Elster's base personality, which floods Elster's mind when she first comes to at her most fresh and raw state at the cycle start. And that brings us to who Elster is and why she's so determined to find Ariane, or Is it Alina? Rose Engine tactfully suggests that Elster's journey may be a conditioned response to her programming, the instinctual longings of her Gestalt neural patterns, presumably Anna Huang's love for Alina. Anthony Terrence of The Escapist notes that The King in Yellow has an excerpt that's remarkably similar to Elster's disjointed sense of purpose, where the narrator says his chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement for his friend and love interest, the three of which are caught in an awkward love triangle. What this obligation was, its nature, was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a crisis. Elster gets to keep enough of her base humanity to be useful to the nation, but not enough so that she can't be controlled. But since replicas aren't just man-made machines but connected to the mystical song of the gods by the nature of their creation, I think it's safe to say that she's a lot more susceptible to feeling these things genuinely and not just as conditioned responses. In fact, Elster units are meant to be self-sufficient loners, but our Elster is finding that she can't do without another person. But once she experiences art and love, her personality very likely destabilizes and requires Ariane's constant psychic encouragement over the course of the game to wake up and keep their promise, whatever that might be. But the entirety of her hero's journey isn't just trying to keep her promise to Ariane. It's a journey of accepting her burgeoning new identity and coming to terms with the suffering and the impermanence that accompanies it. Now we'll circle back to the deeper aspects of Elster's journey once we get to the endings, but for now, let's see how other characters are models or reflections of Elster and what that says about her role in the stage play of Ariane's dream. The first mirror self of Elster we run into is Itou. She was the one we played in the flashback, where she saw Ariane's bullying while looking for her twin sister Erica, but she couldn't bring herself to intervene. Now, this failure on Isa's part, as well as her search for Erica, seems to inform her entire little meta journey inside of Signalis proper. Just read this note that we see in-game. In the end, it was my sister and not me who helped Ariane that afternoon. I just watched until she appeared and did what I never had the courage to do. I didn't know her at all and was myself been a victim like her often enough, but Erica didn't care about any of that. She did what I hadn't dared to do even in my thoughts. Our brief friendship was meant to be, for me, forever, overshadowed by this moment of paralysis. I've always been useless. When we first meet Isa in-game, she's kneeling over a replica she stabbed to death with her knife. "You don't belong here either, do you?" she asks. "There's something wrong with this place." She's aware of the artifice of her surroundings, but is compelled by some arthurial force that she can't resist. So like Angela from Silent Hill 2, she picks up a knife and goes out in search of a female family member. In this case, her sister Erica. She's convinced that Erica left her because Isa was too reliant on her, too fearful. But now she's trying to be self-sufficient and brave for her sister. Isa's portrayal seems to indicate Ariane's resentment towards her for not helping her against the bullies, but also Ariane's hope that she could be better, could be braver. And to a large degree, Isa does get to shine. She fights off Adler, stabbing him in the eye and knocking him down a great hole. She uses the rifle she obtains from him to deliver the killing blow in that Chimera boss fight that we mentioned earlier. But as we near Rotfront, the place where she and Ariane used to live together, we get a vision that seems to be of Isa, inexplicably now wrapped in bandages, her right eye bloodied and missing. When we finally meet her inside the Itou's photo store, she's given up, saying she can't find Erica and can't physically go on anymore. Her features are then transposed onto the pose Ariane usually has on the right side of the screen, before she degrades into black sludge like what comes out of the Grand Empress statue in Nowhere. Now this makes some sense, as she's clearly already dead in the real world, as you find a shrine to Isa and Erica with the tarot card Death on top. In fact, it's implied they probably died in the war before Ariane even left for the Penrose program, another reason why Elster's similar accent may have been endearing and nostalgic for Ariane. But Isa can likely only be as effective as she could be remembered by Ariane. Now, if you've ever read Stanislav Lem's Solaris or seen the movie adaptations, you'll recognize a similarity between the way that these dream characters are limited by the dreamer and the way the planet Solaris works. Planet Solaris is described as a conscious being that reaches out to people inside of its orbit and generates living copies of those people who have often long been dead. But these copies, as lifelike as they are copies of the perception of the people whose mind Solaris is reading, and bears the limitation or bias that the mind being read contains. In a similar way, Isa and the rest of the trapped souls in Signalis are often only as effective as they were in Ariane's life, or were remembered to be. Isa in particular goes from being an inspiring mirror to Elster to a symbol of failure and Ariane's insecurity about being unlovable. In the end, Isa succumbs to illness just like Ariane likely has already. Now, while Issa is a sympathetic character because she's genuine and on a similar path to Elster, the character Adler is the exact opposite. He's a wrench in everyone's plans, a total buzzkill. And you know what? I really like him. He's calculated, pragmatic, and highly organized, and the most self-aware character in the whole cast. It's this fastidiousness that makes him keenly aware that something is not right in Signalis land. He's also a huge simp, the OG kin to Falke's Barbie, being programmed to base much of his self-worth on his youthfulness to Commander Falke, whom he calls magnificent.
Sublime!
I don't know. I have to think about that.
He yearns for her stern guidance, that overwhelming authority in which she bathes the room. His flattering impressions of Falke's greatness reflect the strength and resolve that Ariane wishes she had. But because Adler feels so strongly about Falke, he takes it pretty hard when Falke goes nuts, and he starts hunting down anyone he sees as a threat to his sleeping beauty. He reminds me a lot of Rutger Hauer's character Roy Batty from Blade Runner, a replicant out for revenge against his creators and driven mad by a desire for longer life and human connection not typically afforded his kind. Like Roy, Adler slowly goes mad from knowing too much and will kill any and all who oppose him. But while Roy wishes to subvert the status quo, Adler clings to the status quo for life support, acting like an antibody purging a virus. It's possible he's supposed to symbolize the nation of Yusan's rule of law cracking down on dissidents from Ariane's point of view, or he could even be an internalization of the abusive brainwashing the nation gave Ariane about getting these silly ideas of freedom and thinking outside the box out of her head. He could also represent Ariane's logical side of her brain, the pragmatic side that tells her she should stop trying all these fanciful and outrageous ways to get out of her predicament. Adler hunts down Issa at one point, saying that he's killed her countless times before and that she doesn't belong here. He also pushes Elster down an elevator shaft, who only survives because her fall is cushioned by a several stories high pile of other Elsters. Apparently, Adler's been killing Issa and Elster over and over again, but where did all these Elsters come from and why are they here? This alarming question begins to make sense once we examine Adler's adult diary entries. One such entry has him dreaming what he thinks is a memory of his Gestalt, who administered a tarot card bioresonance test to a white-haired woman who absolutely has to be Ariane. This inclusion right here seems too coincidental not to be either a contrivance Ariane dreamed up, or is made to look so because Ariane has given Adler the form and function of a real person she met years ago. But remember how the nation withheld the information of Ariane's bioresonance that was likely gained from this very test? Seems like Adler's Gestalt would have been the one to make that call, so he's hardly on Ariane's Christmas list if so, and this may account for how off Adler comes off. While Adler likely symbolizes Ariane's learnt people-pleasing or subservience to the fearful reign of the nation, he is also likely Ariane's common sense or rigid logical side, as his analytical nature made him sensitive to the time distortion happening in the dream. He's been experiencing a strong sense of déjà vu. He notices his old diary entries were somehow dated with the current day's date, and many of them he doesn't remember writing or experiencing what they're about, but somehow knows that they're real, like how he remembers talking to an Elster unit with an orange chess piece, but knows that no Elster unit has ever been assigned here. He finds his memory is, quote, a slow accumulation of reproduction errors, a gradual corruption of information, a story, misremembered, slowly morphing with each retelling, like genetic material mutating and evolving, like the replica mind copied over and over from an aging template. Time is looping over and over again in Signalis, worsening the spread of the flesh and torturing those who are still sane enough to feel the cold indifference of time. So what are these cycles of time? Why do they exist? And how do they help us understand the metaphysics or the dream logic of Signalis? A really big hint lies in the soundtrack itself, and the track titled Ewige Wiederkunft, which is German for Eternal Recurrence. Eternal Recurrence is a concept invented by Zoroaster and popularized by Friedrich Nietzsche, also called the Latin amor fati, meaning lover of one's fate. This theory says that life is infinitely looping around on itself, and the actions we take in the present are of the utmost importance because they are the ones that will echo throughout further time loops forever. So it's incumbent upon those who think they're in an eternally occurring universe to reconcile with any mistakes they've made and be intentional in all that they do. Now, obviously this is paradoxical because if it were true, then everything would have already happened as it would forever. But Nietzsche was likely drawn to eternal recurrence as a way to comfort himself in the throes of his continuous illnesses, where the days all ran together in a blur of pain. I can't help but be reminded of the ennui that Ariane felt as she endured cycle after cycle aboard the Penrose, or the absolute agony she must have felt while dying of radiation poisoning. And to make matters worse, it seems that these destructive cycle changes are happening because of Ariane's restless sleep as she dies. The in-game note called The Dreamer reads as such: a prison from which the only escape is death. Deep below, the dreamer floats in a sea of flesh, the red-eye birthing a new world from their dream for eternity. And each time the dreamer turns over in their sleep, the world turns over too, until only flesh remains. A fitfully sleeping Ariane resets the world with every writhe of pain, turning it into more and more a reflection of her dying irradiated body. Nietzsche even provides a helpful metaphor of eternal recurrence by referencing the Platonic Ouroboros, a beast that eats its own back end, creating an infinite cycle of devouring, much like the flesh threatens to swallow up everyone in Sierpinski, Nowhere, and Rotfront. So while it all seems clear that Ariane is causing the loops, the reason why they exist at all thematically speaking seems to be to illustrate the ardor of Elster's journey towards personhood and as a savior figure to Ariane. Remember that elevator shaft full of dead Elsters from earlier in the game? Well, the second chapter of the game, Liminalitat, grants greater meaning to this already compelling image. Liminality is defined as the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in a middle stage of a rite of passage, when participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status, but have not yet begun the transition to the status they will hold when the rite is complete. The Elsters seem to be a visual metaphor for all the repetitive toil of perfecting oneself. Elster's just simply not been strong enough, brave enough, or competent enough yet to fulfill whatever promise Ariane's employing her to fulfill. So on Elster marches, all the way up to a gate. This gate is found near the very end of the game's second chapter, which is appropriately called liminality. Interestingly, the English word liminality comes from the Latin limen, which means threshold. When Elster arrives at this gate or threshold for the first time, Adler is there, and he confirms the connection between gates and thresholds and liminality when he tells Elster that Falke went through and went nuts, wondering, what lies beyond the threshold? Or what could possibly do this to someone, and why? In Nietzsche's novel about eternal recurrence called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra arrives at a stone gateway that winds across his path and goes on seemingly infinitely in both directions, the word moment being written upon the gateway. Commenter Richard Godon notes that he who stands at the gateway, lucidly acknowledging the roads before and behind him, is imbued with a power and responsibility incomparably great. So merely passing through the gate like a turnstile at a busy public transport avoids the power and responsibility of crossing over into a new and better version of yourself for all eternity. But if the world is always looping, then what difference does this make, since it's certainly not the first or the last time this loop will happen? Is the outcome not written in stone already? Godon answers this question too. If it is not literally me that must repeat the act for all eternity, then it is meaningless to concern myself with the existential weight of each decision. It must be the same me, the same everything that recurs time and again. So taking his thoughts into consideration, the hundreds of Elsters in the elevator shaft don't seem to serve much story purpose as literal Elsters, and not just because it's incredibly messy and improbable to somehow figure out how they all physically got here. It seems a lot more like the game's vibe when we consider these Elsters to be past selves in the sense that the person you were yesterday is your past self, and yet not a different self. The reason I'm leaning this way can be found in the description of the Locker or Locker achievement for when you've died 16 times in survival mode. Inside this achievement's description is the phrase Ship of Theseus. Elster greatly resembles the Theseus of Greek myth already, as he famously escaped a labyrinth and defeated a minotaur with the help of Ariadne as his guide. Ariane is the French spelling of the Greek Ariadne or Ariadne, however you want to say that. And Ariane appears to Elster over and again to guide and encourage her back to where she lies sleeping. So where does the ship of Theseus come in? Well, it's a thought experiment that asks, if something has all of its original components replaced, is it still the same object? Does the essence of something's idealized form constitute the true identity of a thing, or is identity tied to the substance of what a thing is comprised of? To me, this is asking us to engage with the metaphysical poetry, if you will, of how replicas are constructed, and whether that influences what they get to become through experience, through new parts being added. Does Elster possess the essence of a human soul because she's essentially copied from another person's distinct personality, piecemealed together from parts of various substances? Is she less human because she's likely attracted to Ariane because her gestalt was attracted to a similar-looking woman in Alina? Is Elster more human because she chooses to act on this attraction with a sense of duty and longing? After all, Elster units are designed to be hardy, self-sufficient loners, and they aren't supposed to be exposed to music, movies, or even befriended. And yet here, Elster is taking copious damage and experiencing great psychological pain for someone who, it could be argued, is just the object of desire out of cold computer code convention. But this theory doesn't quite hold up. Even if Elster started out as just responding to base urges from her programming, she's clearly in some kind of autonomous control now, acting on feeling and instinct and desire rather than just zeros and ones compunction. But either way, at this point in Elster's journey, she hasn't come into her own yet, and we see this play out in dramatic fashion at the 2/3 mark of the game, where the game appears to end, before busting out some big revelations and restarting another loop that takes us to our meeting with Falke and the various endings. Now, we'll go into everything that Falke likely stands for, and then we'll examine what the memory, promise, and leave endings mean, and how they recontextualize all that came before, and how they don't lend themselves to surface-level readings and are actually codependent on each other to a certain extent. Most importantly, we'll analyze the mind-bending artifact ending, which makes the other 3 endings look positively bland by comparison, giving us the answers on what Ariane has become and what role the King in Yellow has played in this nightmare. So let's start at the beginning of the end, the Fakeout Ending. On your way up to the Fakeout Ending, you'll travel through flesh-infested nowhere and open a large door with 6 locks, which opens into the bottom of the hole you saw in the intro, except this one's fleshy instead of snowy. It still has that winding, definitely not OSHA-certified staircase, and at the top we find the gate just outside the hole, a reverse journey from the intro. At the top, we see the gate scene we mentioned earlier. Adler is there kneeling before the gate, a knife through his eye where Issa stabbed him earlier. He's notably the first of many characters to soon be missing their right eye. Adler laments that it's impossible to move on. I have been here so many times but never returned. The commander never spoke about what she saw out there. I'm sure whatever it was, it made her fall sick. Something about her changed when she returned. She was no longer our beloved leader Falke. What waits beyond the threshold? It doesn't matter, Elster replies. German flashes before us, which translates to, at the end, the way home. I'm waiting, implying the Penrose is where Ariane is. We turn to Elster walking the red emptiness, black pillars dotting the landscape. Beyond the gate, emptiness. We hear Achtung from the real-life radio broadcast we heard in the intro scene, and who are you and what are you looking for flash on screen, and we pan down to one of the many Elster bodies lying against a pillar. Hab kein Angst? Or don't be afraid flashes. Why are you here? I've been waiting. 2 very conflicting vibes. Suddenly, Alina Seo's name flashes up on screen, and we see a row of 6 women. Only one woman who looks just like Alina we saw in Elster's photo turns her head to respond to the name Alina. We see a red gateway burning through the center of a painting, one we've seen many times throughout the game, which is actually a real-life painting by Arnold Bachlin called The Isle of the Dead, which notably was copied numerous times over the course of Bachlin's life, much like the replicas are in the game. But hold that thought, as one of the most important images of the game is coming up right now. Elster's name flashes on screen, and all 6 people turn their heads, the first being presumably our Elster, another a white chest-plated Elster, an Elster missing an arm, the orange spacesuit Elster from the intro, an Elster lookalike with a military beret that's likely her gestalt, and, at the end, Falke. Ariane Yang's name flashes, and we're back to the original 6 people. And this time, Alina turns her head, but so does Ariane in her school uniform, and so do 3 versions of Ariane in the Penrose program. One where she first joined with her short hair, another with slightly longer hair indicating time has passed, and another with the patches indicating her sickness taking hold, and yet again, on the far end, we see Falke. We see then the Isle of the Dead painting again interpolated with another real-world painting called The Shore of Oblivion by Eugene Bracht, which also had multiple versions of it made. The Achtung voice sounds again, and Elster takes a hit. Did she just receive the transmission from the intro? Be Not Afraid flashes again, and we see a glimpse of Falke pointing down at Adler. Be not afraid is a common greeting that angels in the Bible give to those who are extremely fearful when they first see them. Falke has a halo around her head suggesting that she is a higher being like an angel, which will come into play later. Elster fluctuates with paintings inside her body, copies within copies. Then the artifact flashes on screen with its 6 sides. Then we see flashbacks that are commonly attributed to Elster's gestalt. A brown-haired woman stands atop an old road that's surrounded by floodwater, like on Veneta. The same woman watching what I think is the attack on Veneta by the Empire. A woman who looks like Elster's gestalt holding a bloodied right eye. The photo we saw earlier of Alina and Elster's gestalt, who is more than likely Anna Huang, but don't quote me. Ariane implores us to remember our promise and to wake up. Elster vibrates with the images of paintings, then tears her arm off trying to open the door like Ghost in the Shell, and then she falls. We now have the third Elster in the lineup we just saw, the armless Elster. What's important to note is that Elster can't get the door open here. She's simply not strong enough yet, despite her many times trying to get to this point. And yet, this is the farthest she's ever come, based on all the dead Elsters we passed on the way here. We zoom in on her eye, an image we've seen on the menu screen, except now it's devoid of that red glint from before she drifts deeper into death. Since Ariane has red eyes and is no longer reachable, I assume this red disappearing indicates Elster has lost her reason and her will to live. And for some people, this was the end of the game, and Yuri Stern even said it was constructed in such a way to feel climactic for those who didn't know that this ending was a ruse. If you look carefully, you can tell that the option that would normally read Continue on the main menu now reads Begin. Begin what, you might ask? Why, begin another cycle, another time loop, of course. Wake up and remember our promise. So feeling like someone's played some Metal Gear Solid recently and wanted to do something as meta as the Psycho Mantis fight, we dutifully begin, which leads us to the Ariane and Elster flashback aboard the Penrose, the scene fading to black as they dance to Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. This beautiful memory over, though, we hear the Achtung message again, likely Ariane reaching out through space and time to Elster with the familiar and relevant warning about danger that she would have heard working as a radio operator like her mother. Elster finds herself lying in the red emptiness, her right arm shredded, Ariane now standing over us. Do you remember our promise? She seems to blast into our soul, rousing Elster. Suddenly, we're back in the icy tundra of the intro, and we make our way inside the Penrose, though noticeably we aren't shown having to unlock the door at all, as we do in the actual later endings. We read notes about Ariane's suffering, how her hair and teeth are falling out, and how pain racks her body. Then we enter the cryopod where she should be lying to find the entire cryopod covered in flesh, and next to her, of all things, we find a white chest-plated Elster just like the one we saw in the lineup of 6 Elsters just a little bit earlier. Elster replaces her missing arm and covers her ruptured chest cavity with the white chest plate from the dead Elster, reconstituting herself from herself, another nod to the ship of Theseus thought experiment. If all of something's original components are replaced, is it still the same object? I made a promise. I'll do anything, she says. The compartmentalizing trauma flash screen is particularly charming. Stuff down the pain and start again, it seems to say. I can't stop now. And we dive into another hole, and a timer counting down from 100 hours starts, which makes me think we've just restarted a new cycle. Now, worth noting is that not every hole dive starts a new cycle, but some seem to. Much like how in Christopher Nolan's Inception, Cobb is able to descend into deeper levels of someone's dream that get increasingly more abstract and alien, just as Sierpinski and Rotfront degrade more every loop. Strangely though, instead of waking up somewhere else, we find ourselves on a dark beach with mountains on one side and dark waves on the other. Turns out we're actually walking inside the Shore of Oblivion painting. On the sandy beach, 2 very ominous notes. Something old, far older than humanity, sleeps deep below the ground. Those of us who can hear its call in the night, an invitation, an ocean of memories where I ends and we begin, which is a very Ocean of Solaris sounding idea. But further down the shore, we see a rowboat run ashore and waiting for us, which is not a detail in the Shore of Oblivion painting, but one that's carried over from the Isle of the Dead, in which we see a ferryman rowing a white figure in a covered box, likely a coffin, acting as a Karen, taking a soul to the underworld across the Black River Styx. I'd argue this is meant to mirror Elster coming back for Ariane and guiding her soul either to death or through it, depending on what she finds at the end of her journey. It's also worth noting that the red aperture in the middle of the Isle of the Dead painting is in the shape of the rock faces in the original painting, but is also the same shape as the threshold gate, and they have the same empty red space behind them as well, not to mention one puzzle has us putting a key inside this exact area of the painting for a puzzle earlier on in the game. Something about this painting is the key to understanding Ariane, who is credited in-game with painting both the Isle of the Dead and the Shore of Oblivion, both of which she has concept photos of on her wall in the intro and the ending. So out of this small section, we need to remember that Elster is likely the ferryman carrying Ariane across a black river, and that she's either guiding her to death or helping her come to terms with the fact that she's likely dead already or hopelessly stuck between the two. We'll also want to remember this ocean of memories that is likely the waves crashing against the shore of Oblivion, waves which signal where the individual ends and we begin. No Signalis character exemplifies this metaphysical struggle to retain individuality more than Commander Falke, so let's bring out the Great Lady herself. Now, we haven't heard much about Falke up to this point. We know that the infection started affecting Sierpinski shortly after she returned from beyond the gate, and that her sickness was likely amplified and spread by the empathic Calibra units who can't help but rebroadcast extremely strong emotional signals. Other than that, our only real knowledge of Falke before her boss fight is how we played the Swan theme from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake into the owl-shaped container she was holding in her sleep. This owl-adorned container may seem like just another bird reference like all the replica unit names, Elster meaning magpie, Storch meaning a stork, etc., but it's actually a clever little clue referencing a character from Swan Lake itself, the story of which we need to examine closely because it provides a lot of thematic context for the somewhat confusing convergence of motifs that is Falke. Now, a quick shout out to my mom who homeschooled me all the way up until college and made me a lifelong fan of Tchaikovsky when she had me read the excellent historical fiction story Tchaikovsky Discovers America. So anyway, fanboying aside, let's check out Swan Lake. The most common version of the ballet begins with Prince Siegfried being asked by his mother to choose a bride at his birthday ball. He blows her off and goes hunting with his friends instead, eventually spotting some swans swimming near a lake. Right as he's about to shoot one of the swans, it turns into a beautiful woman in white named Odette, who reveals she's been cursed to live as a swan by day and a human by night because of the evil owlish sorcerer named Rothbart, of whom Falke's Owlbox is likely modeled after. The spell could only be broken if one who has never loved were to swear to love Odette forever. Sounds a lot like a certain replica we know. Siegfried and Odette fall for each other that night, but Rothbart intervenes right as Siegfried's about to confess his love for her. Siegfried attempts to kill him, but Odette stops him because if Rothbart dies before the spell is broken, she and the others will be stuck as swans forever. Rothbart is subsequently driven away, and Siegfried returns home in time for the birthday ball, where all he can think about is Odette. There, Rothbart plays a fiendish trick, turning his own daughter Odile into the spitting image of Odette. Siegfried mistakes Odile for Odette and declares to the partygoers that he intends to make Odile his wife. Odette has followed him back to the party though and attempts to get his attention through the window, but Siegfried realizes his mistake too late. Odile is wearing black and not white like Odette was. Distraught, Odette rushes back to the lake and Siegfried follows after her, begging for her forgiveness. But the spell cannot be undone now, for he has declared his love for another. Realizing that only death can unite them now, the two lovers jump into the lake and drown, which also kills Rothbart as the spell is broken. Siegfried and Odette are then lifted up to heaven, finally united forever. I think it's pretty clear that Falke is supposed to represent Odile as they're both in black and look like dark mirrors of the white-clad Odette and Ariane with her white hair. But the symbolism gets a little murky, and that's because the symptom of Falke's sickness is her mind being slowly overwritten by Ariane's influence until she can't tell whether she's Elster or not, as if she's both an idealized version of what Ariane hopes Esther will be, but also a bit of wish fulfillment for whom Ariane wishes she could have been in life. A spicy detail is that Falke's theme in the soundtrack is even Ariane's theme backwards. Falke's diary is rife with despondent scribblings, the pages replete with drawings of red eyes and Penrose triangles. This is a fitting parallel to the Penrose 512 ship that occupies an impossible-to-explain area of space and time that caused Falke to lose her marbles after seeing what Ariane had become. Falke describes her experiences as follows. I don't know how much longer I can go on. I do not want to live anymore as what I have become. The red eye beyond the gate showed me, no, touched me, poisoned me. It feels like my mind has been contaminated, defiled by another person's memory. I am no longer fully myself anymore, but I've not fully become someone else either. A crashed ship, a strange gate, a hole in the ground, an island beyond reach, memories from other lives, dreams of suffering and loneliness, a promise, a search for someone lost. I saw her in the red emptiness waiting for me. As the memories of a stranger rushed into my mind, I felt the borders of myself blur. I can no longer tell where Falke ends and Elster begins. Falke seems to be a composite of Ariane and Elster, a freakish bridge between their psyches, manipulated by Ariane's dreaming as much as Odile was by her father and his schemes. As interesting as Falke is to ponder as a story device, she's also a tragic figure, being imprinted just like the replicas were upon first creation. She's powerful and confident, unlike Ariane, the social outcast, but her dualistic, conflicted nature is a manifestation of Ariane's insecurity over her self-worth and also her fear that Elster may not be able to fulfill the promise. So when Elster meets Falke, she's been driven mad with fear at her own obsolescence. But instead of cowering, she rises like an avenging angel to beat back the invader of her soul. "God won't forgive you," she bellows, a chilling yet cryptic line that I think references Ariane, which we'll unpack a bit more soon. "Both of us, we are incomplete. Let us become whole again." In Falke's eyes, there's only room for one Elster hero figure in this town. In this regard, Falke embodies the classic shadow or shadow self of Jungian psychology. The shadow is comprised of repressed emotions and desires, both good and bad, that are believed subconsciously to be unworthy of the ego's idealized version of what you want to be or what you think of yourself. One often encounters this shadow through projection onto other people, where we find ourselves judging them harshly for qualities in ourselves that we don't like and haven't reconciled with, which is a perfect correlation for Ariane projecting upon Falke. A similar concept to the shadow self that may help us kind of visualize what Falke is can be found in the concept of the dweller on the threshold, or the guardian on the threshold. This concept dates all the way back to the 19th century and has been represented by St. Michael's dragon, the Cerberus at the gates of Hades, and the snake in the Garden of Eden. The most useful iteration for our analysis today is from the Twin Peaks show. The Nez Perce tribe in the Twin Peaks region believe
there is also a legend of a place called the Black Lodge, the shadow self of the White Lodge. Every spirit must pass through there on the way to perfection. There, you will meet your own shadow self. My people call it the dweller on the threshold. If you confront the Black Lodge with imperfect courage, it will utterly annihilate your soul.
And the fact that Elster keeps failing over and over indicates that she's not in possession of such a quality just yet. Fortunately for Elster, as superhumanly intimidating as Falke may seem, she's also been twisted by Ariane's projected fear and insecurity, which makes her dangerous, but self-destructive. Falke is the dweller on the threshold, literally and figuratively, as she often stands on the steps leading up to the gate, to liminality, to Lyman, the threshold, and she must be defeated in order for us to achieve our own enlightenment and fulfill our promise to Ariane. And so Falke, the fallen angel, ironically wreathed with a large halo, warps reality around Elster and eventually rains down spears on her head. It's an incredible spectacle, but the precision and lethality of Falke's weaponry ends up being her undoing, as we run her through with her own spears until she looks like poor Asuka in Evangelion, as she was stabbed through the eye with the spears of Longinus. As Falke dies, she notes that we are whole again, and we see a vision of Ariane and Elster embracing on the Penrose, an image we've never seen till this point. Then the kanji for promise flashes on screen. Falke must have housed the memory of the promise that Elster has been missing this whole time, the perfect courage or perhaps perfect knowledge that she's needed all along. We run into Adler one last time, his face completely fleshy now and missing one eye. "Once again you've returned," he remarks. "Are you really willing to go through this once more? You've seen what happens. This world cannot take much more. This may be our last chance. If you go back, it'll all fall apart. I can't let that happen, you selfish monster." Elster approaches Adler and he attacks her with the knife pulled from his own eye, stabbing Elster in her eye but taking a bullet at the same time. Elster grabs her bloodied eye just like we saw in the Fakeout Ending's Gestalt memory flashback, history repeating itself, Elster's humanity coming through yet again. Now, one quick note I wanted to make. While I was looking up images for the Dweller on the Threshold, I saw a random movie still for a low-budget 2016 short film of the same name, with a dark-haired woman missing her right eye, who in the film stabs the Dweller's eye out as well. Call me crazy, but this seems almost too coincidental not to be part of the game's inspiration, but don't quote me, I just thought it was too cool not to mention. "You'll destroy everything," One-Eyed Adler warns. Elster ignores his hot pocket-looking ass and continues to the Penrose where she finds the latch on the hatch just as she left it, slightly ajar from where she broke her arm the last time. This is notable because it means that not everything resets between loops and that progression is possible. Note too that every ending has you approaching the Penrose as the white-armored Elster. More on that soon. In all the endings, the 2 hatch handles are always raised, meaning you tried them before, whereas the Fakeout ending has both completely flat, as if they've never been pulled, indicating you've never gotten this far before. And that progression is carried over between loops, meaning that not everything resets and that progression is possible. What I'm trying to say is Signalis is a roguelite. You heard it here first, guys. Inside Arion's quarters, we find a shocking but perhaps unsurprising sight. Elster's dead body on the floor. I couldn't keep my promise, she says. Despite my best efforts, I eventually fell ill too. It had to end this way. So clearly, even with the knowledge of whatever the promise is, it's very likely that Elster has to keep being woken up because she died after putting Arion in cryosleep. And the events of this wish fulfillment come to life is to rectify this seemingly unsolvable problem. So is it possible to reach beyond death? Can love really do that, or is it just small comfort against inevitable tragedy? Well, as the door to the cryo chamber says, it's time. This is all that's left. So let's go home and find out the answers to our most pressing questions. There are 4 total endings that we know of, and 3 of them are determined by your playstyle, resulting in a different cutscene after you click on the cryo chamber door. The 4th one is a secret ending, and it's the most confusing and thought-provoking, so it'll be handled separately here shortly. Now, despite you only being able to earn 1 ending at a time, the 3 playstyle-based endings seem to be different loops, not necessarily discrete canon endpoints for the story. Shared details imply some paradoxical connection between them too, where they seem to come one after the other, but always need a detail from one that hasn't happened yet. Let's check out my best attempt at chronological order to see what I mean. The leave ending is earned by playing in a rush, avoiding combat and NPCs. You go to the door where Arion would normally be in her cryopod, but instead you pop out on top of the ship in what looks like Veneta, where Esther's Gestalt was from. In the end, I had to leave you behind. It's too much. Forgive me, Elster defeatedly implores. A wistful Elster that lacks the white chest plate wanders towards the horizon before falling into the fetal position. Now, this doesn't necessarily indicate her death, perhaps an eternal purgatory where she's stuck embracing her old Gestalt life and never ascending to become the Elster that Arion loves, that she needs. Too afraid of accepting what befell Arion, and possibly even realizing there's no known way to keep these loops from continuing until nothing remains. The memory ending is earned by beating the game in 6 hours or less and only healing or speaking with people when you have to. In this ending, the cryo chamber looks pretty peaceful compared to when we were here in the loop after the Fakeout ending, as no dead Elster is present and the lighting is naturalistic. I've come back for you. It's me, Elster. Elster? Arion asks. I'm sorry, but I don't remember. And then, I'm back, but you're not you anymore. Perhaps this is hell. Elster collapses near the cryopod, and as she dies, she asks Arion, let me stay next to you a little while longer. Arion's arm rises to stroke Elster's hair, a last moment recognition that she at least knows she should care for Elster. But because Elster didn't take out the monsters of her mind or engage with the good memories represented by Issa and the replicas, she never quite pushes through the cloud of Gestalt memories and affections to find herself and her true relationship with Arion. Before we move on, let's note that this ending appears to provide the white chest-plated Elster the other endings show when Elster first arrives. The promise ending is earned by dying often, taking lots of damage, and killing lots of enemies. So because I choose violence on a daily basis, you can imagine this was the first ending I ever got. It's also the one people think is the best ending, but I don't think it's that simple. Elster approaches Arion in the cryopod. The background is blood red and ominous, much like the bloody retribution against Arion's enemies we left in our wake. Elster kisses Arion's forehead. Arion says Elster as if to remind her of something. I can't do it, says a crestfallen Elster. You have to do it. It's time for this to end, please. Elster says, I'm sorry. And with that, she wraps her hands around Arion's neck and strangles her to death. The timer runs down to 0. Another cycle ended, perhaps for good. Thank you. Arion somehow manages to gasp. Elster kisses Arion on the forehead one last time before collapsing next to the cryopod, the red glint in her eye going out, which is an important detail for when we talk about the artifact ending. So here's a conundrum. If this is called the promise ending, then the promise must have been to $1 Million Baby Arion if Elster woke up again, putting her out of her misery, right? You'd think, but I don't think it's that simple, as we just saw Elster over her dead body, lamenting that this version of her couldn't fulfill the promise because she became ill too. It seems likely she could have killed Arion long before Elster was ever close to being incapacitated by her own pain, not to mention Arion would have been a prime candidate for this treatment long before her pain became truly unbearable, as this was quite a slow burn. Before we move on, do note that this white-armored Elster is in the same pose as she was in the loop after the Fakeout Ending, likely indicating it predated that loop. The loop after the Fakeout Ending could be seen as a later loop, at least in the sequence of these other endings, as it has the downed white-armored Elster present in it, loosely implying it happened after Memory and Promise. But I wouldn't look into it too deeply, as only one of them should have the white-armored Elster there, and the next would have that same Elster missing that chest plate once the other takes it. This is another example of seemingly relevant information being almost intentionally paradoxical or nonsensical in context of other information. So let's absolve ourselves of the obligation to figure some of this shit out. Some things don't make sense for some reason. I wouldn't say that's okay because it's a waste of the player's attention, but I won't pretend it doesn't seem entirely intentional. And on that note, let's enter the last major theory section of this video, an ending which I think is the ultimate wish fulfillment, an indication of some hope or tranquility for Ariane and Elster. Or perhaps it's a deal with the devil, but let's find out, shall we? The artifact ending is the only ending that doesn't require killing Falke, and can only be unlocked by tuning your radio to one of the 3 frequencies you hear on the Achtung radio broadcast in 3 specific rooms, netting you the key of love, the key of sacrifice, and the key of eternity. These keys unlock the safe back in Ariane's room, which reveals a lily inside. We cut to Elster placing these lilies atop a gloomy recreation of those grave markers that we saw in her Gestalt memories. Revelation 9:6 flashes on screen, and in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it. Elster drops dead at the foot of the marker. The scene pans out to show the other 5 markers have bodies underneath them too, and in the center we see a fleshy coffin or cryopod-shaped box with a glowing object in its center. Looking closely, we can see a hexagon shape within it like the artifact sign, and so many other shapes throughout the game. Then we see this phrase: "The mystery of God is complete, as she has proclaimed it to her servants, the prophets." We see the Penrose 512 one last time, and above it, a watchful red eye. Remember our promise. We then see a white-armored Elster dancing with Ariane in the dilapidated remains of her Penrose quarters, the Swan theme from Swan Lake playing them off. So, what was that all about? Well, let's start with Ariane's safe and the lily inside. This same lily is in the Rotfront radio station flashback where we first obtained our radio, and it was atop the 6 grave markers on Veneta and the Gestalt memories that we saw in the Fakeout Ending, which is presumably Elster's Gestalt commemorating fallen comrades from the Empire's attack on Veneta. Lilies are commonly associated with death and the soul passing from the body, hence its presence at funerals. In addition, the Japanese word for lily is yuri, which is also a term connotating Japanese media about female relationships, and often about lesbian relationships. Yuri Stern being the name of one of Rose Engine's members should also tip us off that that is possibly where the developers' heads are at too. A lily being the symbol of lesbian romance, it makes sense that it would be held in a safe space, no pun intended, as if deep within Ariane, and also that it would be Elster's offering, both as a commemoration of the departed, but also as a tribute to their romance. But the lily also corresponds to the second story of the King in Yellow called The Mask, which features such a flower very prominently. The sculptor and alchemical dabbler Boris plunges an Easter lily into an elixir, turning it into pale, blue-veined marble, a process that generates a ray of light, which Boris notes is the signal that it worked. So, who knows if Rose Engine took any inspiration here. The narrator Alec notes that Genevieve, he and Boris's mutual love interest, looks as fresh and sweet as that lily, at least before Boris destroyed it, a description which Boris scoffs at, saying, "Destroyed? Preserved? How can we tell?" Genevieve at one point even falls into this substance and is thought dead in her white as snow marble state, until she miraculously awakes as the effects of the substance wear off. Ariane's white hair, like lily-white Genevieve who awakes from seeming death, seems a pretty obvious comparison to make here, as does the elixir's effect resembling Ariane's limbo state, perhaps even describing replica creation too. Okay, so that's what the lily represents, but upon what is Elster offering up this lily? Well, these pillars, like we've said, look like the grave markers from the Veneta flashback from Elster's Gestalt memories. So we are reverencing the dead here after all, and the only dead person we know of is likely Ariane, and definitely Elster as we saw her body in Ariane's quarters right before the Falke fight. It's also probably no coincidence that the grave markers look so much like the ones that the Zila Corporation spoke through when having meetings in Evangelion. Evangelion appears all over Signalis, so it's prudent to at least consider this connection, especially since earlier we noted that Barbara Whitman of Rose Engine said, "Signalis, the game, exists in a conversation with the works it's inspired by." So hear me out. This is just speculation, but this seems almost too good to pass up as possibly being relevant. So the word Seele is German for soul. The shining object with the hexagon in its center has the blue-white tint of the marble in the king in yellow, certainly, but it also looks just like the artifact symbol found on the safe. I also found the artifact's resemblance to the Alatir stone in Slavic folklore to be possibly very enlightening here as well. The Alatir stone has healing properties, is used in love spells, and represents the passing from one world to the other. It's also called an altar in and of itself, or is associated with an altar on an island called, get this, Buyan, which is also the name of the Empire's capital planet in Signalis. Elster uses an altar of sorts to offer her sacrifice too. Don't think this is relevant yet? Well, the Alatir stone also shows up a lot in wedding and love songs, and is often mentioned with what type of flower? You guessed it, a lily. I think that this shape is Ariane's Seele, or soul, and the 6 pillars represent 6 attempts or 6 deaths needed to reach or free Ariane's soul from limbo, possibly healing her from the state and helping her pass from one world to the other. Now notably, around these markers we see the regular-looking Elster, the armless Elster, the white-armored Elster, and the orange spacesuit Elster from the Fakeout Ending lineup, but we don't see who's at the top pillar, and we see what has to be Itou in her green outfit here as well, whom we suspiciously saw cutting her hand open in a kind of blood ritual over the artifact sign in a brief flash screen from earlier in the game. If this is Issa, it means that we are missing Falke and the beret Elster in this scene. Falke missing makes sense as we are avoiding a confrontation with her by choosing this ending, though we know from our analysis earlier that she likely holds the promise within her. So if she's not there, then Elster is either attempting to circumvent the promise or determine that the promise wasn't good enough or could be improved upon, as Ariane and Elster are likely dead already anyway. Or maybe this is more in line with the spirit of the promise if the promise was, don't let me suffer and don't suffer alone. This ending seems to be Elster coming to grips with their fates, accepting what cannot be and appreciating it with the memorial. But there may be more to it than that, something more transformative. What if Elster is also offering up herself as the final seal to break open Ariane? Note that in this ending, we don't break the final 6th seal on the King in Yellow book and go after Falke, but we do drop dead around a very ceremonial looking circle of our other selves. And then we see Ariane and Elster dancing to the Swan theme again and the screen cuts to black, which really makes me think of how Odette and Siegfried jump into the lake and die together so that they can be united in heaven. Now this isn't the only sort of religious imagery that's in the game. Elster offering up a sacrifice to appease the god of her universe, so to speak, reminds me a lot of how the Old Testament Hebrews in the Bible sacrificed to God to earn his favor. So let's just get into all the other ways that Signalis gets kind of biblical by the end, and see how these concepts are being used to illustrate what Ariane has become, or has at least come to represent in Elster's eyes. This brings us to the question of Ariane's power or godhood, which answers 2 questions. Is Ariane the power player here, or is the King in Yellow? Interestingly, Ariane means silvery, which could reference her fair complexion and white hair, but it also means very holy, a possible nod to something special about her, something set apart. We already talked about how she resembles Alessa in her control over Silent Hill, but I think we need to look to Evangelion again for a little bit bigger picture. Ariane also greatly resembles Rei Ayanami, a red-eyed, light-haired woman often depicted with bandages on, much like Ariane. Like Ariane, Rei is emotionally subdued, and turns out that she's actually a body housing the soul of Lilith, a super powerful otherworldly creature that's the mother of all humans. And by the series' end, Rei ascends to godhood through the power of the soul within her, becoming a looming giant who holds the dark moon in her hands and looks down on the world, much like the red eye of the artifact ending does. Notably, Ariane is the most prominent character with red eyes, and so it's almost too obvious that this eye represents her watching over Elster as she works to reunite the two of them. This transcendent image seems suggestive that she is, as a bioresonant, possibly stuck between life and death by the power of the Song of the Gods, fighting through time and space to conquer death, a battle she cannot win without Elster completing this ritual. But why do I mention Ariane as a god? Well, Signalis gets rather biblically epic by story's end, especially with those 2 quotations from Revelation. The first passage from Revelation states that men shall look for death and not find it, which sounds like Ariane wishing to be relieved of her suffering. But what of the second passage? Notably, the original passage from Revelation reads, "The mystery of God is finished," or complete, "as he hath declared to his servants the prophets." But in Signalis, this passage reads, "The mystery of God is complete, as she hath declared to her servants the prophets." Not he, as in the king in yellow, but she as in Ariane, for whom the verse is appropriated to fit. I'm reminded of how Falke is both Ariane and Elster's double, and she's seen in the pose of the classic Renaissance angels as she stands atop the threshold steps, and how Elster also falls to her knees in a way before the altar with her offering, as if invoking or reverencing the divine. The 6 bodies are likely meant to be the prophets, devoted disciples following her even to death and possibly beyond, as this ceremonial circle seems to imply a religious rite has taken place, possibly one of rebirth, as symbolized by the lilies. And while some like me may find it a little distasteful to appropriate Bible verses to prop up your heroine, if we're playing along with the spirit of the work, this line grandly illustrates Elster's devotion to Ariane as she offers up the symbol of her most formative moments, as if Ariane needs pieces of herself in order to transcend her suffering and join with Elster. I think this pronoun switch from he to her in the Revelation 10:7 paraphrase confirms that Ariane is the center of this universe and the catalyst for everything that happens. The biblical and cosmic horror tropes are for theatrical effect and for grandeur's sake rather than as a commitment to lore or dogma. Sure, there's notes that mention a creature beneath the ice on Rotfront, the persistent appearance of the king in yellow at the beginning and end of the game, and even on the beach the second time you visit, the visceral nature of the flesh and nowhere and the 6 seals, but all of this seems like elaborate pageantry appropriated from these works to express the feeling they engender in you, not to convince you of their literal existence within this world. We're asked to care about the individual who's been exploited by a collectivist authoritarian government that snuffed out the joy of being unique and creative and free, overriding Gestalt minds with propaganda just like they had the neural patterns of replicas. If anything, I'd say that the King in Yellow isn't the supernatural force behind the game's events, but a metaphor for the nation of Yusan as they twist and constrict their citizens, Gestalt and replica alike. Notably, in interviews before release, Rose Engine avoided explicitly calling the game cosmic horror, even when the interviewer prefaced their line of questioning with this phrase. Rose Engine instead emphasized dystopic sci-fi horror and how Elster is stuck between these dreams tinted with subjectivity and a totalitarian regime, with forced labor camps. The nation follows you around with the red light of their security cameras at every turn. Their coinage is said to look like a red eye, and there's even a legend about the red eye phenomenon on a moon of Rotfront that's said to represent their ever-watching eye. So Ariane shows herself to us as a red eye in the sky, flying by, so high.
I'm just flying by, oh so high, like a kite.
Because she's gathered up all the inferences and stray theories from her life into one symbol. A symbol of power and reach and even supernatural rumor. The King in Yellow can't be God, and he can't be the devil here, because the game isn't really interested in blaming either of them. It wants replicas and gestalts to realize that their station in life is not the end-all be-all, that they have control over their fate, or at least dignity, when faced with death and suffering. I'm reminded of that incredible passage in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Cassius speaks to Brutus about how they must take out Julius Caesar before he could become too powerful. Brutus has misgivings because Caesar is a friend, but Cassius responds by saying,
Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonourable graves. Men, at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings.
Replicas and gestalts are underlings in this world, dwarfed by the crashing footfalls of the nation that sits astride the galaxy like an implacable giant, swallowing all the artfulness, freedom of expression, and joy. But Ariane, by her very artistic and conscientious nature, lives outside the measured step of the nation. So she takes to the stars to find peace, and eventually she finds more, before it's tragically ripped away. The lucid dream that is Signalis then becomes about Elster's search to find herself by finding Ariane. For what is the love of another, if not the most affirming self-knowledge that one can experience? Sifting through memory and trauma in endless loops of recall can then be seen as Ariane's test to divine out the Elster she knew, whose own fractured psyche is fighting through the programming and instinct to actualize her own feelings, to own them like nothing she's ever owned before. But no matter what ending you get, Ariane and Elster are likely already dead, so the promise can't simply be to kill her. She can't live forever in this state any more than Elster did, who already died. Thus, the memorial Elster makes in the artifact ending can be seen as a triumph over the tyranny tyranny of grief and deception. To know oneself and to know another as lovers do is to know the tenuous position of loves that hangs over the pit of grief, always in danger of falling. Truly appreciating the preciousness of our connections with loved ones is a victory over death, the final shot in the war against the tyranny of mad kings and grand empresses, the cruelty of our peers, and the vicious cycle of self-doubt waged on us from within and without. Thus, change begins within us and expands outwards to purge corruption from around us. It's sometimes all the light we have. The fault is not in our stars and the fates, but in ourselves. And we must face ourselves with perfect courage and face each other with perfect love, which casteth out fear. If only we could live forever as we do now, the secret message above Orion's safe wishes. Signalis doesn't want us to think of these connections as a movie with a runtime that eventually runs down to zero like the timer, but as a snapshot in our mind's eye, a postcard whose quality never wavers, never changes. Do this in remembrance of me, it says. May love reign over us. Dylan Thomas wrote a poem that was actually featured in the remake of Solaris. This poem sums up so much of Signalis, and I'd like to leave you with this poem called And Death Shall Have No Dominion. And death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one with the man in the wind and the west moon. When their bones are picked clean, and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. I'm reminded of that scene in Blade Runner where the replicant Roy Batty comes to his creator Tyrell to extend his rapidly expiring lifespan. As he thirsts for more life, he sorrowfully tells his creator Tyrell that since his creation he's done
questionable things, also extraordinary things. Revel in your time.
So, my friends, as I leave you today, please promise me that you'll remember to revel in your time. I just really want to give a huge shout out to my lovely patrons, Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, James Wyatt, The Nth Review, and Yaxo. Thanks for watching.